So welcome everybody. I'm Heather with the New England Museum Association. I'm Director of Administration and I'm currently in Somerville instead of our Arlington offices. Just want to say hi, and I want to say thank you for all of everybody joining us today. I did mention earlier that it will be recorded and available on the NEMA website later. You also have the option to either, if you do want video, to pop that on, or if you want to be casual and not pop it on, that's fine. We also, for a town hall, we have a bunch of different options for actually speaking. So we're actually hoping to actually get everybody speaking, talking, or typing in the chat feature. So there is the option to unmute yourself. If you do want to actually verbally talk to answer questions or throw questions back out to the group, that would be great. Or you can put it in the chat feature and we can read them out loud. That works too. So it's really up to you guys. These are, more your town halls. So it's the way you guys want to play it. And I want to introduce you to Alex. He is actually our NEMA Fellow for the NEMA conference. So he attended the conference. He'll be writing a couple articles for us in the journal. And he's also the director and curator at Albans Museum. Is that correct? Did I say that right? Okay. So I'm just going to throw it over to Alex to get you guys going on what we want to do, throw some questions out there. This is definitely going to be one of those interactive webinars where we want you guys to actually interact with each other, interact with Alex, ask each other questions, and that would be awesome. So Alex, I'm going to let you take it over.
Awesome. Thank you for the introduction. Good to see you. Hope you're doing well and staying safe and healthy. I'm connecting with you from St. Albans, Vermont. We're about 20 minutes from the Canadian border. I'm the executive director of the St. Albans Museum. We're a seasonal site, a 3-story former schoolhouse constructed in 1861 that operates the exhibit spaces from May through October. We have a climate-controlled event space, so we do programming year-round. I am the only staff member, so we're certainly the definition of a small shop. And I have about 25 volunteers who fill a variety of roles. So we started in 1966, meeting in members' homes. The museum opened in the former school building in 1971, and they just transitioned to paid staff in the 2000s. So we have a sort of a really strong tradition of having an active and engaged volunteer program. And I'm happy to be here with you today to talk a bit about what we've done, to share some ideas, to hear from you about what's working for your organizations, and to also chat a bit about challenges and opportunities. So maybe the first thing to do is just to tell you a bit about what our volunteer program was like before. We started managing the current public health crisis and COVID-19. We, as I mentioned, had about 25 volunteers, so a 15-member board, sort of separate from that. And then the other volunteers were sort of split into 3 main groups. Collections and archives. These are folks who worked in our research room, helped with exhibit design, registry and cataloging and past perfect and things like that. Our docents, who are our summer tour guides. We had folks who helped out with special events, administrative tasks, building maintenance. We have a rental space that we use upstairs for community events and weddings and things like that, ranging from high school students who are earning their community service hours. We've had several college students serve internships these past 2 summers, and then the majority of our volunteers are adults and folks who are retired, so sort of all across the spectrum and involved in all sorts of programming. What happened, just to kind of kick off where we've gone since then, March 12th here in Vermont was the day that we started sort of receiving guidance about closing businesses and public spaces, restricting gatherings. And this is where we first sort of started to hear about social distancing and physical distancing. And what we wanted to try to do was make sure that we were letting volunteers know, as soon as we kind of made the decision, we're closing the building, we're suspending the program. We wanted folks to know that, once we had sort of a grasp of what was happening, statewide and nationally and internationally, that it was important for us to communicate that this wasn't we're locking our doors, we're closing down, and, we're waving goodbye until we open up again. That our, volunteers had an important role to play, and even if they weren't going to be serving, quasi-staff functions anymore, that they were part of our museum family, and that we wanted to stay engaged and keep them informed about what was going on. So if I were to share some best practices around sort of that initial communication, the first thing we did was create a continuity plan that sort of explained how our board was going to operate and how we were going to continue to communicate. That took a lot of one-on-one coaching, getting folks comfortable with Zoom was the platform we adopted, and using shared docs through our Google account and things like that. And keeping up with kind of regular communications. So our volunteers previously had received an email a week, from me that would outline the schedule or talk about upcoming opportunities, programs where we're working on, those sorts of things. And so we kept that going so that they would continue to hear from us. We also were mindful of folks who don't normally connect with us digitally, who don't do email or don't do email often, and that we were making sure that they were able to get printed copies of some of these communications so that they may have been isolated from us in terms of our physical space at the museum, but that they were still hearing from us and an active part of our group. And so that consistent communication, being honest and transparent about what was going on, sharing where our decision-making was coming from around, extending dates for social distancing based on what we were hearing from the governor and the Vermont Department of Health. So that was kind of phase one, was just establishing a routine for communications, getting people the ability to connect with us, and like I said, doing a lot of one-on-one troubleshooting with folks on the phone and on the computer, so that we were in a place where everyone who wanted to be engaged felt like they were comfortable staying connected with the museum as a volunteer and kind of maintaining that identity during this time. Any questions or experiences anyone wants to share about what their initial days were like and shifting their volunteer program?
I should also mention, if you guys want to put in a chat feature so everybody knows what organization you're coming from, that might be helpful too, so you guys can see exactly who's on the town hall to get the conversation going. You also have the opportunity to unmute yourself and actually speak and answer the question too.
I can speak a little bit more, I guess, to, and maybe this might kind of gel with what your process was like. Once we sort of established that sense of continuity and we came up with a communications plan, we recognized that we also had to be mindful about kind of the tone of our approach and how we were sharing things, recognizing that there would be a spectrum of responses, right? So there are folks whose capacity right now is limited, due to personal circumstances, things going on at home or with their work, and so that they just weren't in a place where they could be a board member right now or be a volunteer right now. And we wanted to kind of honor that and acknowledge that, for others it was, I can come to some meetings, but I can't really, commit to much else. For some people, it was trying to find ways to keep that social connection. We had a really strong sense of camaraderie and working together, and how could we continue to just have some of that kind of FaceTime and share jokes and things like we used to do when we were together. And really allowing folks, the ability to grieve a bit, right? That there's that great article going around from Harvard Business Review that, that discomfort we're all feeling is grief, and that's true. And I think it's come into relief even more so maybe in the last week than it has previously. So giving people the space and always being mindful that we were creating opportunities for engagement and for work, but that they were all completely optional, that we recognize that, participation would vary or ebb and flow depending on what was happening, outside of the museum, so to speak, in people's lives, and to really be intentional about understanding that this wasn't about productivity, that this was about engagement. So certainly, in a small shop like ours where we only have one full-time staff person and a part-time intern, we couldn't operate without our volunteers during normal times. So especially during a time of crisis, we can certainly use the help in a lot of ways, but we wanted to be really intentional and mindful about not overburdening anyone or not making anyone feel like if they weren't contributing in a way that they had before, that they were somehow being deficient as a volunteer or supporter. So to be very sort of gentle and patient and understanding with all of that. And the other piece, and you've probably heard Dan talk about this a lot, is that while we are sort of in this space where we're really focused on the present and we need to be right for health and safety and all those needs we need to take care of, that there is room to plan for the future, and that it can be okay. For some folks, you know, connecting with the museum as a virtual volunteer is about a sense of normalcy. It's a space where they can kind of connect with that sense of self or sense of purpose that is, you know, maybe they're not feeling in other areas of their life. For others, it was that social connection and just a way to kind of be engaged in an everyday sort of way with folks that they had spent a lot of time with. So just to be mindful of that, establishing continuity, understanding that it's going to be a variety of responses for folks, being regular and consistent in your communications, and then asking volunteers, how do you want to help? So, you know, traditional volunteer structure for cultural organizations, I'm sure lots of you have job descriptions and assignments and things where, you know, traditionally you would say, this is what we have available, and, you know, contact us if you can kind of fit in to one of these projects or programs or something like that. And so what we really wanted to do was ask folks, you know, how do you want to be involved? What would be meaningful for you right now? You know, what's your capacity? You know, are you comfortable with some of the technological pieces? And we sort of left it as an open-ended question so that we were both encouraging folks to be active without, you know, pressuring them or without there being, again, these expectations of productivity. It's really about engagement. And I had some volunteers that was a struggle for, you know, if only we could get in the building, you know, think of all the photos we could scan, or, you know, all the work we could get done. And so having a conversation about doing what we need to do to be kind of safe and healthy right now, and also recognizing that it doesn't necessarily have to be about finding things on the traditional to-do list that we would have been having a conversation about 2 months ago. So being able to kind of reframe your expectations and your experiences was a really important transition for us.
Alex, I do have a question for you. What's your kind of age group for your volunteers?
So I did mention at the beginning, we span the spectrum. We have high school students working for service hours. We have college students fulfilling internship roles, but the vast majority are working adults or folks who are retired.
I'm also curious about the other people that are here today. What is your spectrum of the volunteers that you are working with prior to everything happening? So it'd be interesting to find out if it's just one generation or if it does go the gamut like that. Mostly retirees.
Alex, it's interesting. I've heard at other NEMA webinars how one science museum is engaging their volunteers by having them pick up trash on their morning walks or afternoon walks. And although it's not a direct relation to the museum, it's still kind of an ecology focus. And I wonder, you know, have other folks kind of engaged their museums with similar parallel projects?
I think that's a great point, Scarlett. I think there are some real opportunities for thinking about the work or the missions kind of in a broader sense in ways that may not entirely touch on your own institution. So some of the examples I share with you today for digital volunteering are national initiatives that aren't necessarily connected to our work, but get people involved in sort of thinking historically. We're also partnering sort of regionally. And I think, you know, one of the conversations we've had as a board is around, you know, that this can't only be a time where we're focusing on finances, that we have to also think about mission and, you know, how can we serve the community in new or different ways, or what role can we play? And I saw from some of the comments, you know, some folks have students, but it sounds like most of you are working with volunteers who are older Americans, retired, that sort of thing. And I think there's some real opportunities there to push through some comfort zones and traditional barriers around technology. You know, if you are able to provide some one-on-one support or task someone who's willing to make a phone call or do a video chat with someone to literally see their screen and walk them through, I can't tell you the difference that made for volunteers who I found out later were really struggling and were ready to kind of give up and kind of walk away from being engaged. And we did 2 or 3 outreaches to make sure that they were able to connect. And I'm seeing a question about maintaining continuity you know, for new staff contacts and regrouping. Again, I think this is about, you know, if there are regular communication channels that you normally use, to continue to utilize those, to find ways to introduce folks who are leading, you know, your volunteer program now, or doing the coordination, and to not be, you know, be afraid to maybe communicate a different way, or make it personal. So we just did a little fun thing where we had everyone take selfies and with signs about what they missed. You've probably seen a lot of teachers doing this, right? These great touching tributes for their students. And for us, it was a fun way, you know, to sort of connect and be together in a way that was new. You know, if I had talked about taking selfies before, I would have gotten a lot of eye rolls from folks. So just being willing to take these small chances and do things differently, and to, you know, make sure that the conversation is about, you know, how can we find something that works for your capacity, you know, your availability, and your schedule. And I think that example you gave of, you know, even if you're not able to do something that directly impacts the institution, if you're able to sort of be an ambassador even for 5 minutes on your morning walk by doing something that's related to the mission, or being part of a larger, you know, community effort that echoes with what you do already as a purpose-driven organization, that still has meaning and importance.
Has anybody else had experience in the group here about, you know, missing a staff member basically that works with the volunteers, and someone having to kind of step up to take over that role? Be great to hear from you guys. We're a quiet group today. I guess the other follow-up question, because Alex, you were talking about being in touch with your volunteers. How have the rest of the group, have you guys been in touch with your volunteers? Do you do it pretty regularly, or was it one and done? Hey, we're kind of closed and we'll reopen sometime. Or are you continually doing that reach out? Because I mean, it is a relationship, and it's a much needed relationship, because a lot of our museums, you know, do rely on our volunteers to help us do a lot of the stuff that needs to get done. So I'm just kind of curious to see how you guys are reaching out to your volunteers. Is it continuously, that type of thing? So you're welcome to unmute yourself or type in the chat. That would be great.
Hi, my name is Brittany. I work at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and we've done something similar with trying to stay in touch every week with constant communication, just general updates, or saying, hi, here's a new article you can read to, like, you know, pass the time. We have a big volunteer corps, most of them are retirees, and it's around 100, with about 90 to 80% of them being docents. So keeping in touch with all of them has been tricky in terms of check-ins, especially since a good percentage either aren't the most comfortable with checking emails, or a couple of them don't even have computers at all. So we kind of created like a web system. So I have a few volunteers who I've talked with before, like around that March 12th week, being like, can you be my point of contact? That way, if there is a big news or big update, they'll call individuals that are also volunteers to kind of help spread the message. So it's kind of like a buddy system in groups in a way. So far, it's been working. I think I only had a couple people who fell the loop who I knew may not be connected with them, but for the most part, I found that's helped to kind of take a few volunteers who are very active with communication and have them team up with you with communicating information, especially if it's like at least during that first week, everything was pretty urgent. So we needed like all hands on deck to help us reach everyone.
That's great to hear. Yeah, it's like the phone trees, you know, back before the computers happened, you know, everybody had a phone tree to tell someone else what was going on, or school was closed or something. So phone trees are good. You know, it's like, it's one thing that I think a lot of people, we take for granted, that we all have communication tools, you know, computers, iPhones, or some kind of Android phone, when some people don't have that option. And that's good that you're thinking about them in that respect, making sure that they're still, you know, in contact with people and not abandoned, basically. So Elisa is, she wrote in, the hard part for me is the big programs we have volunteers work in have been canceled for the summer. And we were trying to figure out new programs for people to work on. Lots of potential trainings are needed. So I guess that does bring up another question of like retraining them once you guys get back into the organization. Have you started thinking about that at all?
So I think one of the things that I sort of resisted maybe in the first weeks because I was still processing everything. As you heard a lot about, for nonprofits, now is the time to reinvent and take risks and reorient. And I think we were all sort of maybe struggling just to come to terms with what was happening. And it's like, I barely have space to perform basic functions, let alone do something radically different. But and with a bit of time and space, I've become a lot more open to that possibility. And I would say to you, in terms of your volunteer program, that it may that you may want to consider opportunities and to do things that echo, previous efforts or have some familiarity, but that you're not necessarily tied to trying to replicate what you did before in a new way. I mean, if you think about the parallel to schools, for example, teachers that go from, like, in a K-12 environment, working, 8 hours with students every day, what they're doing now is not online school where they're replicating that classroom environment. They're doing enrichment, they're providing choice opportunities, they're trying to give students maybe a couple hours worth of work to process. They're not concerned about evaluation and things like that. So I guess I would say, as you're thinking about your volunteer program and your capacity, are there new things you can try? I can tell you we are launching our podcast for this week. And we've been talking about a podcast for about 3 years. We talked about it after the NEMA conference last November, and we never had the time. And suddenly, found the space and the tools and lots of folks willing to be interviewed because they were home and now had time and had stories to share. And so we're launching that this week, and that had a really strong volunteer component to it. So it may be time, letting volunteers have access to running some communications channels, an article in your e-newsletter, social media. If any of you have seen hashtag the cowboy, that phenomenon.
That was a good one.
Right? Like, there's some really great opportunities. And again, it's recognizing that we're just in a different place. I can tell you, as a solo shop director, my practice for a long time was to always take a look at every communications piece that went out before it was published. And now we're in a space where maybe I can be a bit more relaxed about the voices that are communicating through our channels. So are there opportunities for your volunteers to get involved in social media? I would think about, you talked about retraining for some of these new opportunities. So obviously the first thing that comes to mind is, can you do some sort of video series where you walk people through? Can you do a town hall type meeting or a call-in? Accessibility is one area where I think we need to be a bit more intentional in terms of connecting with folks during this time. Again, not everyone has the access or the technological skills or equipment to, connect with in the way that maybe many of us can. One great thing about Zoom is it has an auto transcript feature. So, if you are going to do an online training, can you work from a script so that you can provide text for folks who can't access a video to stream? Or can you use the transcript function to make sure that there's a written documentation of what you were trying to say? I'm seeing, in the chat that there are maybe ways to, connect through email that are not specifically related to your work. We had some folks put together a private Facebook group that was kind of just about connecting every day and saying, hey, how are you? So that was kind of the first point I wanted to make, is that there may be opportunities to do something new and different. You have to be mindful that you're not going to do them the same way that you always did. You can think about, in terms of your institution, is there exhibit work that can be done? And, the first challenge to that is, right, you're not in your collections and you're not in the exhibits. Now, we had to switch to Past Perfect online, so maybe we're slightly better positioned than others. But is there an opportunity for you to do research, design work, writing labels, and other things that don't necessarily require physical access to the building? Have you thought about new ways to do educational or family programming? I'm seeing now these great sort of live streams of presentations, arts performances, music, and things like that. Is there a way that you can take a program that was either going to be run by a staff member or volunteer and find a way to share that content digitally so that folks can access it? Is there a class you can offer, or a skill, something like that?
Yeah, so have any of you guys actually let the volunteers take over some of your social media or planning or Elise says no. I know it's maybe for more of the smaller organizations and stuff like that where they have more of a thing on that one, but it is kind of interesting because I think a lot of people that I've been watching, a lot of the museums, that it's suddenly like the staff members that you never see are the ones that are in front of the camera talking to everybody now. Usually I'm the one that you don't see, and here I am, that type of thing. So I'm also wondering, you know, are you guys actually letting your volunteers do some of the content and stuff like that? I know you got, for the most part, most of you guys are coming from history organizations, so it's a lot of research, things like that. So just kind of curious to see what you guys are doing in that respect. Okay, we can keep going.
So Justin mentioned about,
Yeah.
you know, you can find ways, you know, if it's more your organizational style to have volunteers contribute research that you can then kind of produce in a way or edit and then push that content out. Our big thing in our community is we do a weekly feature in the newspaper. So I have volunteers now. I've given them all online access to our newspaper archives. So they're able to go through and find old photos and to kind of do write-ups on, you know, this day in history type of thing. So that's one area where volunteers are generating content and helping us maintain continuity with a feature that had been sort of a regular part of our operations when we were sort of open normally.
And I'm also curious, have any of you guys asked for your volunteers and stuff like that to actually start keeping a journal? Because that's what a lot of organizations are now asking for, is like, keep a journal of how you're handling the pandemic, what you're doing, you know, stuff like that, your thoughts and stuff like that. Because if you look at history stuff, there's always those journals of this is what was happening during this magic time in history. And I'm just curious if you guys are actually asking your volunteers to also contribute to something like that.
This is Sandra. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Sandra.
This is Sandra from the Public Health Museum in Tewksbury, Mass. And we have a very small volunteer staff of about maybe 15 and one paid staff member. And what we are currently doing is we are designating a dedicated spot on our website. And this is all, again, volunteer if they wish to participate, with one board member and about 4 of us. We are designating a spot for the health crisis and the history of pandemics in the past. So we are looking back to supplying articles that we will write, definitions, links to current and past areas of pandemics or outbreaks. So anyone going to our website will eventually find this link, and it's sort of your one-spot shopping for anything they might want to know more about. And our training also involves, and I am the coordinator for the volunteers, so I'm actually weekly asking them to coordinate our writing articles for our newsletters, reminding them to study the tour scripts for those who need it. We have that available on tour cards online. And we also have videos about the museum that we've linked to for them as well. So a lot of what you have previously mentioned to keep in touch, we've done. So, and I understand what you were saying about for those who want the information, for those who may sit on it a little bit, but it is all there for them to refer to and to keep in touch with. We have not done any Zoom or any podcast as such. I like that idea, as well as keeping journals. And most of our volunteers are retired, although I've recently, just today, got about 4 emails from high school and college students to write blogs or write for our newsletter. So it's actually been pretty active.
Thanks,
That's
Sandra.
great.
You're actually like the perfect museum that is handling this right now. So, because I know you have a lot of health records there at that museum.
Well, it's actually, we go back into the past history of infectious diseases, mental health, early nursing. dentistry. So our exhibits are typically very historical, but it makes a really good connection on what is happening today.
No, it does. That's great.
I think it's.
I'm Elizabeth Lee. I have a couple thoughts.
Okay.
I am happy to be on this call with Elisa Nelson, who is our volunteer coordinator. I have a sort of interesting conundrum right now, and some of your ideas are really helpful. So we use AmeriCorps members. I shouldn't use the word use. We members and have them at our site for several years, and it's really been a huge addition to our they're not supposed to be called staff, but our team. And there's a restriction or a requirement that they serve a certain number of hours.
Yeah.
And I'm really having to puzzle through how to create alternative ways for them to do their service hours, and trying to figure out, the idea came to me just as you guys were talking about how they might, or what opportunities there might be for them to interact with the volunteers, because we can't even get to our site until probably June 1st. And so on board our AmeriCorps members, we don't even know we don't even know if they'll commit to us, because they don't know what's going to happen either. So it's sort of an interesting little piece of that, but maybe some opportunities for them to interact. And the idea that we're kind of like a couple of the rest of you, that we had ideas before that we wanted to do and that maybe now we could do. And in particular, Elisa and I have had the idea but not made much progress on some online training. And I'm kind of curious, so that was just some chat, but my question is, what kind of online training, do you guys have online training that is for all of your volunteers, or are you just creating new media because of now? Do you regularly do online training? Like what are the most important components or successful components of your online training? We're just interested in that.
It's a good question. And just a follow-up, has AmeriCorps given you any idea of what to do with them at all to get the hours in? Because I know there's lots of museums, because I know Providence Children's also has a huge AmeriCorps group.
Yeah, too. I can I can share my experience, which is in Vermont. So I work at the Maritime Museum in Vermont, and we are AmeriCorps has a lot of very strict regulations, and to submit a member position description and adhere to it pretty strictly. Or their hours won't count. And if their hours don't count, then they don't receive their education award at the end of their service. So it's pretty consequential. And I'll be honest, I think that the AmeriCorps doesn't really know how to deal with that. They're trying to find alternative ways for service hours. So I know that in Vermont, one of the hubs for AmeriCorps members for Eco AmeriCorps has allowed their members to count hours and serving any organization right now. Any organization, doesn't even necessarily have to be related to their mission. But all of the organizations are in the same boat, which is that it's very hard to manage, to give someone who has never been in your organization, or even in our case, we have a previous AmeriCorps who has been in our organization and does know us, to delegate online tasks to them when they have no access to our server, and they aren't, in the case of the new ones, we haven't even onboarded them. They have never even had orientation. They don't even know who the other staff members are.
That's horrible timing.
It's just really difficult. And yesterday I had an hour-long conversation about, well, how are other sites dealing with that? And each site is unique. And each hub has different rules about how they work through a service. But this is a piece that's pretty hard for us. And like I say, in some ways it sort of overlaps with some of our volunteering issues. I don't want to make this whole conversation about AmeriCorps. I'm happy to answer questions now or later as best I can. But for one of the things I was hoping is AmeriCorps will allow remote training and orientation to count for service hours, but we don't have ours all ready to go yet. So I can email them a bunch of documents, but how boring is that? What an introduction to our site, which is an incredibly interesting site. So I just,
Elizabeth, ooh, sorry.
yeah, go ahead, please.
It's interesting at the Providence meetup that we had the other week, somebody brought up that they had just started a new position at a museum there and they hadn't really been onboarded just yet. And, you know, they've spent the whole 3 weeks at their home. But what they did do is that every week that they do a staff meeting, they bring a DEAI topic to that meeting. The whole staff does. And so they do a share. So I know it's not necessarily work related to the museum, but it's the museum field. So you could do like a museum share to get them acquainted with the industry. That could be something.
That's not a bad idea. You know, thank you. We are a museum, but the orientation stuff that we usually do at our site is all about the lake and boats and things that I just haven't quite figured out how to do that. You know what I mean? It's not like there's a speaker. They need to go be on the boat and look around. I don't know how to.
Yeah, your site is more hands-on and stuff like that. So
yeah, there are things. You're right, though. There are. The other thing I'm trying to do, and getting ideas from you guys, is having them. I guess I need to expand that member position description. And it loops me back around to the question of volunteers, like what pieces of our orientation could we put online? And I'm just really curious how everybody, does anybody else do online orientations? Does anybody else try and, like, what's your training? You know, the staff meeting idea is one thing I can put into place, but are there any other things that you guys do online for orientation training for your volunteers? Is there a program? Does anybody have like a program specifically? Well, good. That makes me feel better. That listen, we're not so.
Yeah, I guess there's a couple questions there, and they're all fantastic, and I hope I can touch on this quickly and give other folks a chance to also chime in. I just wanted to acknowledge in the chat, someone had echoed, you know, this idea of contemporary documentation, you know, that we're living in historical times. One of the suggestions I was going to make about types of volunteering outside of your organization is to see what's happening with your state historical society. Here in Vermont, we have the Folk Life Center, and of course you have everyone has a state humanities council. So there are some existing programs around documenting COVID-19 that you might be able to plug into or to borrow ideas from. Thinking about collaborations with other cultural heritage institutions. So we partnered with another historical society to do a series of, we call them weekend activities, where we come up with kind of games and other, you know, make your own museum, coloring pages, scavenger hunts, things like that, that we can target towards, you know, young families. And we share the sort of content responsibility across our two organizations, so no one person feels overburdened. Specifically towards AmeriCorps, and I can only speak, Elizabeth, to what our experience has been. We're not a host site, but we have found ways to work with AmeriCorps that are serving other nonprofits that we have existing relationships with. So the AmeriCorps from the local planning commission is helping us build a website for teachers for our kind of premier fall educational program, Lake Lessons, which is all about the ecology and history of St. Albans Bay. We have another AmeriCorps with another organization who's helping with some professional development materials. We have another AmeriCorps who's getting some hours by working with us sorry, I just lost my train of thought. What was it? Oh, just to do some grant writing for a project that's related both to their mission and to ours. So while they're not, so again, specifics I can't entirely speak to, but we've been able to create projects with partner organizations that have AmeriCorps staff that need, you know, to contribute in a different way. And we've been able to kind of hand off some projects where we have some shared responsibilities, or at least have had overlapping relationships programmatically in the past and been able to engage them. I know the other thing that's really big around here, at least in Franklin and Chittenden counties, is they can volunteer for like 211 Vermont, which is a United Way program, in responding to folks who have health and human services related questions. So they go through a training, and then you are sort of given a call sheet and a script, in a frequently asked questions document. So there are maybe other opportunities, like you said, sort of outside of cultural heritage, where your local nonprofit could use some support. But that's been our experience with trying to engage AmeriCorps. And then just to quickly touch on online training, we don't have anything that currently exists. So what I've tried to start doing is adapting and planning, like you have, adapting materials based on what works in our current face-to-face trainings, and then either creating like simple slides or handouts that kind of reflect the main talking points, or doing quick videos. You know, how would I respond to this question? Or, you know, how do I operate the Square reader and things like that, that, you know, should have been in our toolkit all along and we never had a chance to get to. And that's one thing that I wanted to touch on, is there may be some sort of these deep background projects that volunteers could play a role in. We have a board member who is, you know, spending a lot of time with the staff handbook and the volunteer handbook and the board handbook and the bylaws, which, you know, are all things that we barely want to deal with when we're functioning normally. But, you know, it's good to look at annual policies and procedures. And there may be somebody who that's how they want to spend their time, is looking through these documents. And someone else had also mentioned, you know, or how are you dealing with considering reopening and, you know, crowds and things like that. And if you do look at, you know your bone or something like that, and there's some data that shows that cultural heritage visitation, you know, folks still feel like that may be a priority for them. But as we look to kind of the world around us, and we see that, you know, sporting events and school and academics and all these other things are being postponed or shifted to an online version. Again, this is where I would echo, if you can think about ways to either replicate programming that you currently do on site, or you know, a lecture or something like that, they are able to do a digital or virtual option, or are there new ways that you can communicate and share content? Because you know, you have to be prepared to recognize that we are going to be emerging into a space, you know, even when we're maybe beyond social distancing and stay-at-home orders, where it's going to be challenging to interact again. I mean, you know, I went through the grocery store this morning and, you know, fully geared up, and you get home and you kind of, you know, the week before we had a Hannaford to-go order and it felt like winning the lottery, you know, just to be honest about it. Like, it's hard just to do those everyday things. And, you know, recognizing that for a lot of us, our demographics in terms of both visitors and volunteer staff may trend towards older folks, you know, who are in the vulnerable or at-risk category. That's another consideration to take in. So I would say to really be in touch with your municipal officials or your state health department around best practices as we get to a place. So right now, like the Maritime Museum, we're sort of targeting a July 1 opening, and we'll sort of look to local leadership at that time to see, you know, what are our practices in terms of taking care of the building, in terms of, you know, cleaning the facility, gloves, masks, and all those sorts of things. We're probably in a place right now where we don't know the answer to that. So again, if part of what I was hoping to talk about today is, you know, are there other organizations, other nonprofits, your local library, can you team up with them? You know, other groups that you've worked with in the past, your state historical society, your state humanities council, your folk life center, local schools, to either find ways to share content creation, or to share responsibilities, or to share tasks. May just be some things that are helpful to think about.
So also to pipe in, we do have another town hall coming up on May 7th. It's more on the exhibit side about, they've titled it From Please Touch to Do Not Touch to How Can We Touch Again? And that's May 7th, so that's another town hall. It is more on the exhibit side, but, you know, they'll be talking about kind of cleaning procedures, what people are planning on and stuff. It's not quite what we're talking about, but it is something that we're offering in May. There's Meg.
Also, hi there. Sorry, I've had to be popping in and out a little bit, so I turned my camera off so I wouldn't be distracting. But I just popped back in again and heard you mentioning upcoming town halls. Did you guys mention that we've got one specifically relating to interns coming up as well?
Nope, haven't gotten to that far yet.
Well, by all means, sorry to interrupt.
I'm going to throw it back to Scarlett on that one because she's organizing that one.
Yeah, so we had some outreach from folks who were keen on understanding more about remote interns, whether it's in the summer or the fall. So we're going to be having an upcoming town hall kind of similar to this format, inviting everybody to share solutions and silver linings to talk about it. So join us for that. I dropped a calendar link in the chat feature.
Thanks, Scarlett.
Maybe a few parting thoughts, Heather, or?
No, I'm just wondering if you guys have any like follow-up questions
Questions?
that you want to ask the group, since we are here, and stuff like that to kind of brainstorm, because the town hall was also kind of a brainstorming opportunity. So if you guys are coming up with any questions and stuff about, you know, engagement with your volunteers, anything that you'd want to share with the group or things that you've seen, that would be great.
I have another kind of question, something that really floored me. I was really surprised by it. It was on a call about, it was I think it was a NEMA call about working with children after we reopen.
Mhm.
And there was mention, I thought it was really valuable, and there was mention about volunteers being kind of, that there may be volunteers, especially older volunteers who were isolated during this time, who may have been sort of traumatized a bit and be looking for or maybe unconsciously sharing their trauma by in conversation with visitors or visitors. And that was just something that kind of hit me sideways. And I wondered if any of you guys have, if that's, I can see how that could happen, that someone just needed to tell their story. They've been isolated a long time. They felt alone, they felt isolated, what have you, and that just coming up in maybe inappropriately in their visitor experience. I haven't a clue how to deal with that, but it was something that caught my attention as something that we should address, both with our summer staff with children, or our re-entry staff with children, but also with visitors maybe. I don't know how you even open that conversation with docents and volunteers, except for to let them tell their story and say, please don't tell that
Again.
visitor who comes through. I don't know. I don't really know how to handle that sensitively.
I think you're right, Elizabeth. That's certainly a good concern, and maybe this echoes Sarah's question about, should we send volunteers personal notes? Yeah, that's one thing I did, just to kind of break up the monotony of email, was to send everybody a postcard, just, we miss you and we're thinking of you, and hope to be together again soon type of thing. But in terms of, what you mentioned, and again, we have to sort of be mindful about, how we talk about trauma as non-practitioners. But I would say, if you're able to create some space maybe where you can process through some of this, to come back together as a staff and then maybe as a volunteer team, so that you're creating engagement and opportunities for conversation before you're engaging the public, that might be helpful. So maybe some of that kind of shared experience, kind of storytelling, that sort of reintegrating in a world that's not social distancing or isolated. Can you create kind of social opportunities, but also ways to sort of to be upfront? And I think that's important, is to not acknowledge it or to pretend that it was sort of something we got through and now we don't have to think about it anymore, is not realistic. And then to keep finding, so I would say, if you could create some spaces where you could maybe try to mitigate some of that by having those chances for folks to share. I think it would also be worth reaching out to, like your local United Way, or if you have connections to some, here in St. Albans, there's one kind of prominent mental health and human services agency. Get some professional advice. How can we do what's best for the visiting public as well as our volunteers when we come back together? May also be helpful.
I think that's also important to maybe remember that, like, even if you sort of give people that opportunity and they feel like, yeah, okay, I've had a chance to say my thing, like, kids do have a tendency to ask some really uncomfortable questions, and, things that adults might find uncomfortable or triggering or, just inappropriate. So in whatever kind of reopening discussions and training people might be planning, you might want to think about what kinds of tools for redirection or other things that you can offer volunteers so that they're not caught flat-footed, because I feel like oftentimes the things that happen worst are when we're caught unprepared for how to answer, you know, some particularly insightful or rude question that, you know, like a 7-year-old will ask. And it's not limited to 7-year-olds. There are plenty of adults who are equally inappropriate.
Right. I mean, we've all faced that, you know, our normal visitor interactions and guest services, dealing with folks
Yeah.
who
But just
are challenging.
that
Yeah.
the visitors too are going to be coming with their own baggage, and offering our volunteers, you know, tools with which to help handle some of that, so that their own baggage doesn't get, I don't know, you know, brought back to the front.
I think that's great advice.
And Elisa does.
It's like, I just think we need to think about it.
Yeah, Elisa does make a good point on here about, you know, we do have a lot of interpersonal relationships with all of our volunteers. I know NEMA has a lot of volunteers. Thank you, Alex. And so, you know, I think it is, you know, we need to look to the future, and we do need to be positive. I know things aren't looking very good right now, but I think, you know, we have to keep hopeful for the future that, you know, things will turn out positive in the end. You know, it's one of those things that we have to all cope with, but as people that are actually working one-on-one with volunteers, it's just not about us anymore. It's also about how they're doing and how they're interacting. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing a bunch of these networking things too, is like giving you guys an outlet as well.
I would say that's, you know, you bring up a good point too, and how we approach this, to also be kind to yourself, and to kind of set boundaries. You know, I can certainly tell you as a solo staffer, I'm feeling like, you know, the weight of the institution on my shoulders every day, and that I have to be responsible for our financial survival and keeping, you know, board and volunteer members happy and moving forward all the projects, et cetera, et cetera. So I've become a very good friend to the 80-20 rule, and being okay with things being, you know, good enough instead of being perfect or sort of worrying about that, but also setting boundaries for yourself. So even as you are being responsive to volunteers and open and accessible, and, you know, recognizing that when you call someone to talk about a museum thing, you are very likely going to be talking about other things, to also make sure that you're taking care of yourself. You know, setting boundaries around your workday, or your, you know, taking weekends off, or whatever it is. We could probably all be in Zoom all day, whether it was work, webinars, professional development, or just social opportunities. And so how can you take a break from the screen, or, you know, take a break from that sort of sense of it's all on me, to get this right. You know, we're all facing challenges right now. We're all struggling. And certainly, you know, you want to do what's right for your organization and for your volunteers, but it's also okay to be human around all of this, and that you don't need to come up with the perfect volunteer engagement program for living during coronavirus. Like, that's not your job. You know, your job is to maybe find ways to create access and opportunity to engage folks that want to be engaged, and to help further your mission, or it could be, you know, for the betterment of your community, or just turning people on to things. You know, the National Archives, the Library of Congress, Smithsonian all have digital volunteer opportunities for transcriptions. And so there may be folks that are just looking for something like that, where they can really hone in on a project, and that might not have anything to do with your mission. For us, there's some overlap, so it's helping with the project. But just to give people a sense that, you know, you haven't forgot about them, and that there are ways we can continue to work together, but we also need to acknowledge that it's going to look different, and to set our expectations kind of accordingly, I think, is key.
I think that's a good closing, Alex. Positive note, refreshing. So I guess I just want to thank everybody for attending today. I appreciate you guys joining us and stuff like that. I know there's some familiar faces and names, and some unfamiliar faces and names, which is great to see and hear. We do have a full lineup of networking, webinars, lunch with NEMAs. If you guys actually have any ideas, suggestions, or if you would like to volunteer, contact Meg or Scarlett, or myself. We'd be more than happy to set something up, because the whole museum community and the profession really relies on all of us and our networks kind of talking to each other, being there for each other, and sharing with each other. So I think that's the key thing for NEMA, is to make those connections with everyone. So I just want to say sign off, and if you guys can get outside, I know it's blue skies here, so go for a walk with the face masks and everything. So I look forward to seeing you guys at a future event. And Alex, do you have parting words, or is that good?
Oh, I think keep talking, and the conversation doesn't have to end with the closing of this town hall. We can find each other through NEMA and other ways. Stay connected, share ideas. Our museums, when we do get to a place that we're opening up again, we're going to need our board members and our volunteers more now than ever before, and certainly we'll need each other as well.
All right, thanks you guys, and we will see you at a future event.